This exposition of the course of experience contains a moment in virtue of which it does not seem to agree with what is ordinarily understood by experience. This is the moment of transition from the first object and the knowledge of it to the other object which experience is said to be about. Our account implied that our knowledge of the first object, or the being for consciousness of the first in itself, becomes the second object. It usually seems to be the case, on the contrary, that our experience of the untruth of our first notion comes by way of a second object, which we come upon by chance and externally, so that our part in all this is simply the pure apprehension of what is in and for itself. From the present viewpoint, however, the new object shows itself to have come about through a reversal of consciousness itself. This way of looking at the matter is something contributed by us, by means of which the succession of experiences through which consciousness passes is raised into a scientific progression. But it is not known to the consciousness that we are observing. But as a matter of fact, we have here the same situation as the one discussed in regard to the relation between our exposition and skepticism. That is, that in every case the result of an untrue mode of knowledge must not be allowed to run away into an empty nothing, but must necessarily be grasped as the nothing of that from which it results, a result which contains what was true in the preceding knowledge. It shows up here like this: since what first appeared as the object sinks for consciousness to the level of its way of knowing it, and since the in itself becomes a being for consciousness of the in itself, the latter is now the new object. Herewith, a new pattern of consciousness comes on the scene as well, for which the essence is something different from what it was at the preceding stage. It is this fact that guides the entire series of the patterns of consciousness in their necessary sequence. But it is just this necessity itself, or the origination of the new object, that presents itself to consciousness without its understanding how this happens, which proceeds for us, as it were, behind the back of consciousness. Thus, in the movement of consciousness, there occurs a moment of being in itself, or being for us, which is not present to the consciousness comprehended in the experience itself. The content, however, of what presents itself to us does not exist for it. We comprehend only the formal aspect of that content, or its pure origination. For it, what has thus arisen exists only as an object. For us, it appears at the same time as movement and a process of becoming. Section 87 is the last very long and particularly dense as far as what's going on in its section in this introduction to the Phenomenology of Spirit. So you'll probably be happy to hear that it's in some ways not exactly smooth sailing, but it's at least downhill from this point on to the last two sections. Something is going on here that's particularly important, that a lot of people bring up as objections to Hegel when we're talking about idealism. And if you interpret Hegel in the wrong way, there is an almost claustrophobic sensation, at least for myself, that you tend to get from his fairly crabbed writing and prose. The entire thing seems to be one big system closed in upon itself. And we say things like, well, what about my experience? What about particularity? What about, the possibility of something new coming on the scene? And the answer seems to be, well, no, everything that's going on is just this process that's happening within the one, world spirit, which is consciousness. Here, Hegel is talking about the course of experience, Erfahrung again, how we encounter things. And part of what's going on in experience is encountering something new and coming to terms with it. And we're worried here in this section about whether we really are, in carrying out a phenomenology, especially not just a phenomenology of awareness, but a phenomenology of history and historical development of consciousness, whether it really constitutes something that provides us with science, something that shows us necessity and some sort of clear reason for things to be the way that they are. That's a serious concern. So let's see what he says. The exposition of this course of experience contains a moment in virtue of which it does not seem to agree with what is ordinarily understood by experience. He's addressing one of the complaints that people would be making about what he's saying. It says, this is the moment of transition from the first object and the knowledge of it. So what we've been just discussing here before, I've sort of abbreviated our little schema. We've got consciousness, and of course, let's put it in there. Consciousness knows that it's involved in this process. There's a, recursivity there, a reflexivity. Now we got that, right? And consciousness is consciousness of its own knowing of its object. Consciousness reaches out to its object. So he says, our account implied knowledge of the first object, or the being for consciousness of the first in itself, itself becomes the second object. So we've got this transition that took place. And, we talked about that as being experience. We start with something, and then as we realize that it's actually for us and that we're involved in the process, that, the way in which we conceive of it has some effects on the object. Consciousness is able to expand itself out to this second object. And the second object is the nullity of the first, as he says. So he says, it usually seems to be the case, though, on the contrary, when we're talking about experience, that what we're dealing with is contingency, Zufall, chance. We encounter other objects, but we don't do so necessarily like this. We encounter things that are really other objects. I'm friends with somebody, and I place my trust in them, thinking that they are, a completely reliable friend, and then as time goes on, my experience shows me that they're not. But what may actually show me that is somebody else who turns up on the scene and actually shows me what a friend is. And I can't predict that. I can't sort of say, well, down the line there will be this other person, because that would already be within consciousness now, wouldn't it? What happens to us is we experience other objects. You think you don't like a particular kind of food, and, well, a great example. I used to think that I didn't like lamb. As it turns out, I love lamb. I just don't like lamb that's not well cooked. Every lamb that I had for a long time was poorly cooked. I don't know who was doing the cooking of it. I can't really remember, but it tasted horrible. And I was like, oh, I don't know how people eat this sort of thing. And then, by chance, I was invited to an Easter where somebody was serving a lamb, and I was like, oh, what am I going to do? That's the main dish I like to eat. I'll give it a try. And then I was like, this is lamb? Oh my gosh, this is so wonderful. Now, was consciousness setting things up behind the scenes? It seems pretty implausible to say that, doesn't it? Well, Hegel is actually going to say that. So let's go on. He says, the second object we come upon by chance and externally. So our part in all this is simply the pure apprehension of what is in and for itself. It seems like there's this whole realm that's outside of us, and it just sort of happens, and we're observing it and participating in it, to some degree, and that's what really produces experience for us. Well, he goes on and he says, from this present viewpoint, the viewpoint that we're developing here, the new object shows itself to have come about through a reversal of consciousness itself. Doesn't look very good. Although I guess that works nicely for that. Consciousness itself is encompassing this new object and also encompassing its previous phase. There's been a reversal. There's been a growth on the part of consciousness. He says, this way of looking at the matter is something contributed by us. We're actually a little bit more active than we realized, by means of which the succession of experiences through which consciousness passes is raised into a scientific progression. Let me get my eraser here for a second. this process of moving from one object to the next and of moving on from one consciousness to the next is a scientific progression. That is the experience of mind, of spirit, of consciousness through time, through historical development, through finding one thing, working with that for a while, then finding something else and working with that. It appears like this comes to us just from the outside, just from chance. But in reality, when there's a dialectical process going on, Hegel's not denying that some things do happen by chance, that some things are external to each other. There's all sorts of nonsense and BS that happens, all sorts of noise. But when something important is happening in the progression, it's because there is a connection between these. He says, the succession of experiences through which consciousness passes is raised into a scientific progression, but is not known to the consciousness that we are observing. Now, what is the consciousness that we are observing? Or these two consciousnesses? Here's us at the end of the historical process, from the vantage point of 1807 or 2014 or wherever we want to say that we've got a good picture from. We're observing this entire thing. This is an earlier stage of consciousness. This is a later stage of consciousness. Neither one of them are entirely conscious of what is actually transpiring here, only from the perspective of a finished progression is it possible to look back and say, yes, that had to follow, and it did so by bringing in something new, which then was incorporated into this. This is the process of what Hegel has been calling dialectic or determinate negation. This is the power of the negative. So he goes on and he says, as a matter of fact, we have here the same situation as the one discussed in regard to the relation between our exposition and skepticism, that in every case of the result of an untrue mode of knowledge, previous stage, must not be allowed to run away into an empty nothing, just, stay, we can't go anywhere, or it just falls into nullity, or it turns into vanity. Instead, this becomes, let's call it the minus sign, and now we have the plus sign. But the plus sign incorporates the negative. It supersedes it. This is the process of Aufhebung, of what gets translated as sublation. So he says, it shows up here like this. Since what first appeared as the object sinks for consciousness to the level of its being, level of its way of knowing it, and since the in itself becomes a being for consciousness of the in itself, the latter is now the new object. Here with the new pattern of consciousness comes on the scene as well. A new gestalt. A new fundamental way of conceptualizing the world, conceptualizing objects, conceptualizing the self. That's what a consciousness, that's what a gestalt, a form, a shape, a pattern of consciousness that Hegel's talking about really is. It's an encompassing way of being. And it's not necessarily a happy being. A lot of these are quite anguished, quite upset, quite angry, quite impassioned. But that's how consciousness develops through history, through this kind of process. He says, herewith a new pattern of consciousness comes on the scene, for which the essence is something different from what it was at the preceding stage. It is this fact that guides the entire series of the patterns of consciousness in their necessary sequence. That's what makes it a science. But it is just this necessity itself, or the origination of a new object, that presents itself to consciousness without its understanding how this happens. From this vantage point of this gestalt, they can understand how they're in advance past this. They can understand that they have a new object, that this object is fascinating for them, that this object is imposing new demands upon them, that a whole world remains or becomes open to them that was not foreseen from back here. But they're not able to see that they're part of this whole long process. They're missing something. themselves. And so they're going to be superseded as well, in turn, until we finally get to the finished point. So he says, thus in the movement of consciousness there occurs a moment of being in itself or being for us which is not present to the consciousness comprehended in the experience itself. The content of what presents itself to us does not exist for it. We comprehend only the formal aspect of that content or its pure origination. For it, what is thus arisen exists only as an object. For us, it appears at the same time as movement and a process of becoming. This is a very important point to close on here. What consciousness at previous stages takes to be an object, something that it can latch onto, becomes from the vantage point, the better vantage point, the fuller vantage point of Hegelian dialectics, a process. This entire process can be conceptualized as an object. And so we're getting close to launching now into some real concrete, or at least more concrete, investigations of how this is taking place. Because of this necessity, the way to science is itself already science, and hence in virtue of its content is the science of the experience of consciousness. Well, it's not often that we get a paragraph that only comprises one sentence, so we got to take them when we can get them. And here in section 88, that's exactly what we have. So he's talking about this process of necessity that we just looked at, this dialectical, historical, and scientific process. And remember, when we're talking about science, Hegel is using this in a more expansive sense than the natural sciences. So we've got this notion now of stages of consciousness, and each one of them has some sort of experience going on that is going to lead to them moving into the next stage. And we can now chart this out. Now that we're equipped to actually look for it, once we actually have some insight into the historical process, not just on the basis of history, but on the basis of what it is to be conscious, we're able to start seeing these important points of transition. And that's leading us, as he says, on the way to science. Here's where the passage gets particularly interesting. The fact that consciousness is now observing this way to science, all the way to this end point where it's been achieved, means that we're already involved in a scientific point of view. It's one that we are not, so to speak, making up as we go along. It's been there making itself up, but not making itself up in a willkürlich, arbitrary, chance manner, but rather in a necessary manner, but with a necessity that we can't actually see until after the fact. So he says, hence in virtue of its content, the way to science is the science of the experience of consciousness. It's already science itself. We're already, whether we realize it or not, at the end point. The experience of itself, which consciousness goes through, can, in accordance with its notion, comprehend nothing less than the entire system of consciousness, or the entire realm of the truth of spirit. For this reason, the moments of this truth are exhibited in their own proper determinateness, that is, as being not abstract moments, but as they are for consciousness, or as consciousness itself stands forth in its relation to them. Thus, the moments of the whole are patterns of consciousness. In pressing forward to its true existence, consciousness will arrive at a point at which it gets rid of its semblance of being burdened with something alien, with what is only for it, and some sort of other, at a point where appearance becomes identical with essence, so that its exposition will coincide at just this point with the authentic science of spirit. And finally, when consciousness itself grasps this its own essence, it will signify the nature of absolute knowledge itself. how does this entire process attain its end? How does it get to the point? How does it terminate? Well, that's what he's actually going to talk about, not just at the very end of the book, but here at the end of the introduction. And so Hegel tells us that consciousness, at least from the vantage point of the present, is able to have this experience of itself. And he doesn't just mean, getting to know yourself or something like that. He means being able to have this panoramic and systematic view of the entirety of what's important in world history. And world history is the history of consciousness in the world, in its essence, as it develops itself in different times and places, and develops by growing, by incorporating, sometimes also by destroying. As he says at one point, history is a slaughter bench. So he says, this experience of itself with which consciousness goes through can, in accordance with its notion, its begriff, its concept, and that's going to be key here, comprehend nothing less than the entire system, another key term, system, of consciousness. So to truly have self-awareness is not to be isolated by oneself as a single subject. It's to realize oneself in relation to the totality, to the whole. And Hegel thinks that we're fortunately at a vantage point where this becomes possible. Previously, people thought that they were engaging in this, but they weren't truly grasping the universal as such. So he says, this is the entire realm of the truth of spirit. For this moment, the moments of its truth are exhibited in their proper determinateness, not just as abstractions. So, I want to pause here for a second to say something about what we're going to be doing as we go through this. He stresses that these determinate moments, these patterns or gestalten, these stages of consciousness, are not just abstract moments. So, when you think through them and when we're going through them, you want to try to imagine yourself as fully as you can into them. You want to, in a certain respect, try not to look way ahead to where it's going to get to and focus just on what we're actually looking at the time. That's doing good phenomenology, so that you can feel its full impact, so that you can feel the anguish that's involved, the sense of despondency at certain points, and also thereby, when there's a breakthrough, feel the sense of triumph that comes with that. That's to really be engaged in what we call the history of ideas. Oftentimes when we talk about the history of ideas, people think we're doing this very abstract thing. No, we do this, those of us that are engaged in this, because those ideas are living, because they're vital, because they cast a kind of luminosity into our own lives, even in the 21st century. So that's what Hegel is trying to get us to engage in and enjoy. He says, these moments are exhibited in their proper determinateness, not as abstract moments, but as they are for consciousness. How people lived them, how people experienced them, how people thought their way through them. Or as a consciousness itself stands forth in its relation to them. So these moments in the whole are patterns of consciousness, and he says, in pressing forth to its end, its true existence, what it is that humanity has been seeking all this time, consciousness will arrive at a point where it gets rid of its semblance of being burdened with something alien. We often look at the things that we're studying as if they're purely external to us, and we bring them into ourselves. Hegel's saying that if we reach the final point, there really is no inner and outer anymore. That means that we also, as ourselves, can't be egotistical and say, I will be the thing that dominates the universe, looking over as consciousness. No, you couldn't adopt that sort of point of view. You could not be imperialistic and be a good Hegelian, although plenty of Hegelians, probably, I guess, weren't good Hegelians, turned it into that sort of thing. So he says it gets rid of its semblance of being burdened with something alien and some sort of other, at a point where appearance becomes identical with essence, which means that appearance is not identical with essence through this entire process. There's an interplay between them, so that its exposition will coincide at this point with the authentic science of spirit. Finally, he says, when consciousness grasps this as its own essence, it will signify the nature of absolute knowledge itself. Absolute knowledge, both in the sense of that's what knowledge is supposed to be, and it hasn't been able to be that this entire time, although these are shadows of it, but also knowledge of the absolute, knowledge of the totality, and of what a tiny but privileged little speck we are within that vast totality of human beings, each of which has made some sort of contribution to this development of human consciousness.